I'm a sociocultural anthropologist, and most of the time, anthropologists make their arguments by drawing on their specific field of research and field sites. So today I will do the same, basically, and I hope that this will interest you. And my field site is Somalia and the Horn of Africa in general, as well as the migration road from or routes from Somalia to the Mediterranean Sea and Italy. And broadly speaking, my research is about the consequences of war. In this case, the civil war in Somalia. And I would like here to present first a little bit of my previous research related to post-war reconstruction of a city in northern Somalia, and specifically reflecting on how built environment and how urban landscape or the reconstruction of the urban landscape establishes a specific dialogue with the people living in that place, and thus constructing, let's say, data dynamics according to which, let's say, objects and in this case buildings produce subjects as well as subjects produce objects and buildings. And later on I will move to my current research project that probably is more connected with our discussions today, that has to do with the idea of building a digital archive of migration, specifically a digital archive of, in my case, of the migration of young Somalis from Somalia to Italy. And in this case, my main argument will be that building an archive of an online or digital archive of migration is an extremely risky and dangerous endeavor. And so I would like to reflect a little bit on this. It's a project that is we have started since a few months. So I'm just presenting, let's say, considerations and observations rather than conclusions. So here are some buildings probably, and I will return later on this. Here, the idea of digital archives, developing ethnographic research with Somalis refugees and asylum seekers living in Italy, basically, and then establishing or collecting, let's say, narratives as well as photo documentation and audio documentation, and then from this built an archive. Probably the two research topics or the medium terms between the two is the idea of infrastructure. In anthropology, in the last years, there was still is on long discussion of infrastructure from different entry points, let's say, but one of these entry points is the debates on material culture. So I'll try to see how we can look, or at least how anthropology looks at infrastructure starting from the discussion on material culture and then dealing with infrastructure, in the sense that buildings are forms of infrastructures, but also a digital archive is a form of infrastructure. And does infrastructure in general, from perspective of social sciences, are seen not, of course, as an inert, nearly invisible and functional material, a domain of technical solution and arrangements that are independent of the political and the living experience, And infrastructure are not even really what allow or intensify or accelerate already existing practices and experience like traveling, like moving, connecting, etc. But in this idea, infrastructure generates new forms of connection, new forms of practices and social practices that are unplanned and unexpected. So are beyond what was planned and what was intended when the specific infrastructure was built, let's say. And infrastructures, of course, are not a neutral endeavor. And so if we draw from the previous research on material culture, it's clear that infrastructure on the one side open up a number of potentialities of action, of agencies for people. At the same time, they can also enforce regimes of control and build up or create geographies of segregation, for instance. So infrastructure and power, of course, are strictly connected. And in general, probably we can look at infrastructure as an assemblage of people, objects, practices, and institutions that all together produce forms of connectivity, of movement, of flow between different sites and between different groups and between different people. So like the discussion on material culture, let's say the discussion on infrastructure is related to what people do with infrastructure, and considering that what they do is something that it is not inscribed into a predetermined, let's say, idea of infrastructure. Okay, buildings. So the first example that I would like to make. Deciphering an urban landscape. I've studied the reconstruction of a city whose name is Hargeisa in northern Somalia that was destroyed during the war. It was later reconstructed, and the basic idea is that the reconstruction of the buildings of materiality went hand in hand also with the reconstruction of the groups and the community. And the groups and the community there were taking, let's say, specific meanings and forms of identification with the material or the built environment that was under reconstructions, thus showing this, as I said, specific dialogue between people and objects. So showing how men produce objects, produce infrastructure, but also infrastructure and objects produce basically people. And in this specific case, on the one side, it is possible to see, now I will show you some photos also, again, it's possible to see how the reconstruction of the city incorporates specific economic and social forces that characterize this post-war time. But at the same time, the buildings and the new urban landscape is projecting and is producing specific meanings and producing specific forms of identification. The key, let's say, dynamics related to the reconstruction of the city was the relationship between the city itself and the people that were still inhabiting the cities, or those who were coming back from the refugee camps after the initial displacement, and the entire and new and emerging world of the diaspora that was of Somalis that were living in other African and European countries. So the new buildings incorporate a specific, let's say, political economy of connection and of, let's say, producing a circulation of goods and people and allowing in this way these services, let's say, of connection, of infrastructures of connection and circulation of goods and people. The most visible elements of this new built environment were buildings and that were used by companies dealing with money transfer, for instance, and so the moving of remittances from the diaspora sites to the city, or had to do with other form of transfer of goods and people themselves. Thus, this idea of connectivity was really embedded and incorporated into the built environment. It was read in this way by the inhabitants of the city, who were deriving, let's say, from this political economy of connectivity, a number of meaning and form of recognition and identification. The idea that the city was under reconstruction was for them the idea that also the society was under reconstruction, and it was possible also to see how specific, let's say, forms of identification between single groups and single buildings and single elements of this reconstruction, thus showing how these elements of material culture have to do with the construction of identity, with the construction of prestige, and the differentiation between different groups and between different people. Altogether, this new city was a kind of attesting the fact that the inhabitants of the city were included in this reconstruction of the city, but at the same time, it was possible to see forms of exclusions because people that were involved, there were people who were involved with this, let's say, new internationalized society or new diasporic society, and there were people that were excluded from this, and these were the people that then started other forms of migration. Anyway, what is interesting, I think, from this showcase is to see this mutual constitution of objects and people, how materiality produce public meanings, so meanings that become public, and how forms of prestige and distinction are produced by materiality. Just to give you some examples, it's possible to compare, to see how the different discourses that people did from what is here the kind of political monument of the city, so an airplane that participated in the destruction and the bombing of the city in the past, and what is here the new let's say, real monument, I would call, of the cities. There's a mobile phone that participates in these economies and forms of circulation. And at the same time, well, there are a lot of signs of these connections that are reported in the buildings and that people read and that people, you know, derive forms of identification, but also understand the specific hierarchies of these economic forces that are at play there, and also develops, let's say, systems of value, according to which what is connected with the outside is something that is highly valued. There are a number of commercial buildings that may look like as quite normal here, but in reality, in that city, particularly at the beginning, in the initial years of the reconstruction, they were extremely different from all the others. So they were incorporating this emerging new society, new diasporic society, but also they were projecting these meanings to the people, generating forms of inclusions, as I said as well, generating other forms of exclusions. And all these buildings have to do with this economy of remittances and of circulating goods and people between the local place and the diaspora. So this was an initial, let's say, work on where, let's say, classical topics of culture, of material culture were highlighted. From the form of exclusions that I've mentioned, there was the developing or the appearance of new forms of migration from these places. Those who were not displaced by the war, but the new generations that were not participating in this new society, new internationalized and new diasporic society, let's say. So basically the initial forced migration transformed itself into youth undocumented migration via land from Somalia to the Mediterranean Sea through Libya and then crossing the sea to Italy. Well, we have now decided with the a research project, and that's a research group, to try to collect these narratives of these refugees and asylum seekers coming to Italy and building a kind of, as I said, digital archive of migration. So it's possible, let's say, to develop from classical debates on material culture a number of observation or consideration on digital archives. And I think that is quite worth it, reflecting on this. First point is reflecting on changes of materiality and what the changes of materiality imply and what kind of transformation these changes generate. We deal with ethnographic material like audio recordings, video recordings, or photo recordings that is already are a transformation of the narratives that we get from the people that we interview. But then there's the idea to organize all this material within a digital archive, and thus placing this material into a totally new form of materiality. What kind of changes can we have? Well, I think that for our research, at least, it could be extremely interesting to reflect on the fact that this change of materiality generates a remolding or a reshaping of the boundaries between private and public. Archive are something that is public. And basically archiving means putting something that is private into public and generating thus public, let's say, discussion. And at the same time, digital archives are related to what the anthropologist Fred Myers referred to as the possibility of unlimited dissemination of the information that are on the archives, which in itself is something extremely risky and dangerous. Archives in general are an infrastructure of connectivity in the sense that archives built up forms of connectivity and built up forms of relationship between people, or show how, for instance, in the different areas of the Mediterranean Sea, there are relationships between people or how people are involved in the same, let's say, processes. And as I said, also archives are producing specific public discourses. Thus, from a material culture and an infrastructure perspective, all this is something that is extremely dangerous, or at least is not neutral at all. What is it dangerous? Well, the point is that the kind of narratives that we are collecting and the experiences that we would like to represent are, of course, for the people involved, extremely painful experiences. They have to do with violence. People have been exposed to violence in their travels and journeys. And people have been exposed to forms of stigma because they were suffering certain kinds and certain forms of violence. Stigmas that are, or forms of violence that are extremely difficult for them to represent in front of their friends or in front of their relatives or in the families that they left behind, basically. And also their situation in relation to the journey, but also in relation to their life in Italy is a situation of an accumulation of failures, let's say, at least with in comparison to what they were thinking or dreaming, let's say, before departing. So any kind of representation for them and this possibility of unlimited dissemination for them is something that can amplify these forms of pain, let's say. And this is the element that I think we are dealing with mostly. Of course, there's also the other side, let's say, the side of the European public and the fact that these stories challenges, of course, a kind of space of removal and forms of social anesthesia that we have towards this kind of stories and this kind of narratives. So we are dealing with, let's say, forms of subaltern memories or forms of representation of history that are not generally represented or are erased by the, let's say, the history built up by the nation states. So one point is to make this material public in order to challenge these forms of representation. But on the other side, the other challenge and risky aspect is what are the consequences for the people involved vis-a-vis their the groups they belong to. And here what we have found and what we are reflecting upon until now is the fact that on the one side there is in their narratives there's social and individual silencing of the most dramatic sides of their experiences. They want to talk a lot about the current situation in Italy, how difficult it is in relation to housing, in relation to finding a job, etc. But what is part of their journey, etc., is generally silence. Or what is told, it is something that falls into extremely, let's say, stereotypical narratives. The elements of their experience that are already known, and thus that are not disturbing, let's say, their relationship with other people. There's no, as I said, we are working on this. We don't have specific question until now, but what I've identified as a field in which we will work is not really working on the silence and on the untold, but working and considering extremely interesting these stereotypical narratives. Because these are the narratives that have been made public and that have been accepted and that the people use to identify and to recognize that themselves or to build up forms of reflection of their experience, a reflection that is no longer a private reflection, but is a public reflection. So the idea is that we should work in expanding these, let's say, stereotypical narratives in order to expand the space of recognition that any single individual can have towards this public, let's say, representation of their own experience. Thus, getting back to one of the basic, let's say, topics of heritage and museum studies, the idea of reconnecting people and things, or not disconnecting people or things, the effort that we are trying to do is to, let's say, keep the people that we have involved with in this research connected with this kind of infrastructure that we are going to build, in the sense of expanding the possible forms of public recognition of their own experience, so that the archive, let's say, could produce or potentially could produce an expansion or a transformation of their way of reflecting on their own experiences. Thank you.